single mother, alone in the darkness of night, holds her hungry baby in her arms as tears fall silently. There is no food, no money, no hope. She is one step away from giving up on everything when she makes one last desperate prayer. What she doesn't know is that God has already set a miracle in motion, and that a man, guided by something greater than himself, is about to appear at exactly the right moment. A simple gesture, a watchful look. You won't believe how this story of faith, restoration, and true love completely changes the lives of two people who seemed lost, until God shows that He never, ever abandons His children. Sarah was 26 years old, with brown hair always tied in a messy ponytail, green eyes that no longer shone as brightly as before, and a weariness that seemed to have settled into her bones. She lived in a tiny apartment in Newark, New Jersey, one of those places where the wallpaper peels. The musty smell never goes away, and you can hear every neighbor's fight through the thin walls. But for her, it was home, because there was Emma, her 8-month-old daughter, with those curious little blue eyes and a toothless smile that made it all worthwhile. Sarah worked as a waitress in a corner diner, one of those classic American places with red vinyl stools and never-ending coffee. The pay was low, tips varied, and every penny was counted 2 or 3 times before being spent. She had no family nearby. Her mother had died when she was a teenager. Her father had never really been around, and her boyfriend, well, when he found out about the pregnancy, he simply disappeared, vanished like smoke. He blocked her number, moved to another city, and Sarah never heard from him again. In the first few months after Emma's birth, Sarah did what she could. She took extra shifts, worked even when sick, and slept only 3 or 4 hours a night. But life has a cruel way of knocking you down just when you're already down. First, the diner started cutting staff, fewer shifts, less money. Then Emma got sick, an ear infection that required expensive antibiotics. Sarah paid, of course, because what mother wouldn't? But then came the overdue rent, then the electricity bill. Then there was nothing left. That October night was cold, you know? That kind of cold that cuts through your skin and seeps into your bones. Sarah was sitting on the apartment floor, leaning against the peeling wall, holding Emma in her lap. The baby was crying softly, hungry. Sarah had given her the last bottle hours ago, made with the last bit of formula she'd managed to stretch as much as possible, mixing in more water than she should have. Now there was nothing left. The refrigerator was empty, the cupboards empty, the wallet empty. She looked at Emma, with those little blue eyes full of tears, and felt her heart break. "I'm sorry, my love. Mommy doesn't have anything to give you right now," she whispered, her voice breaking. And that's when the shame hit hard. That shame of not being able to provide, of not being enough, of having failed as a mother. Sarah lowered her head and began to cry silently, trying not to make a sound so as not to frighten her daughter even more. She had never been very religious, you know. Life had been too hard for her to believe in miracles. But that night, with her daughter in her arms and an empty stomach, she closed her eyes and whispered something like a prayer. "God, if you really exist, if you're listening to me, I need help. I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how I'm going to feed my daughter tomorrow. Please, just give me a sign. Just show me that you haven't forgotten us." It was a weak prayer, almost without faith, but it was all she had. Sarah didn't know it, but God was already at work. Because that same night, on the other side of town, a man named David sat in the living room of his comfortable home in Montclair, trying to watch TV but unable to concentrate. David was 34 years old, a civil engineer, with a stable life, a beautiful house, a good job. But there was an emptiness within him that he couldn't explain. Since his marriage had ended 2 years earlier, no children, no major arguments, just a silence that grew until it separated two strangers. David felt he was merely existing, not living. That night, he simply couldn't stay still. There was something, a discomfort, a restlessness in his chest that wouldn't leave him alone. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger. It was as if someone was nudging him from the inside, saying, "Get up, get out, go, It might sound crazy, but David grabbed his car keys and left home without a destination. He himself didn't understand what he was doing. He just drove, following an impulse he couldn't explain. He ended up in a Walmart that was open 24 hours, one of those big ones, full of endless aisles. He wandered aimlessly between the shelves, picking up some random things: a box of infant formula, diapers, baby food in jars. He didn't even have children. Why on earth was he buying all that? But something inside him said, "Buy it. You'll need it." David paid, put everything in the car, and kept driving. Without knowing where, just driving. Until he found himself in Newark, in a part of the city he rarely frequented. It was almost midnight when he parked on a dark street, in front of an old apartment building. And again, that impulse. This way. He picked up the bags and, without quite understanding why, went into the building. There was no doorman. The elevator was broken. He climbed the stairs, and each flight seemed to pull him upward, as if something greater were guiding his steps. 3rd floor, 4th floor, until he stopped in the hallway on the 5th floor and heard a muffled cry, almost imperceptible, coming from behind a door. David approached slowly, his heart racing. He knocked lightly on the door. "Hello? Is everything all right in there?" Silence. He knocked again, a little louder. "Please, I just want to know if everything's all right." On the other side, Sarah froze. Who on earth was knocking on her door at this hour? She thought about not opening it, but Emma was crying so much that she couldn't think straight anymore. With trembling legs, she stood up, still holding the baby, and went to the door. She opened it just a crack, the safety chain still attached. On the other side was a tall man, with slightly messy dark hair and worried brown eyes, holding grocery bags. He didn't seem dangerous. He seemed tired, worried, human. "Sorry to bother you," David said, his voice soft. "I know it sounds strange, but I heard a baby crying and, look, I can't really explain it, but something brought me here. I bought a few things and, do you need any help?" Sarah looked at him, then at the bags, then back at him again. Tears began to stream down her face. She couldn't speak. She just opened the door. David entered slowly, looked around, and saw the reality. The apartment was empty. There was no furniture besides a mattress on the floor, an old baby chair, and some clothes piled in a corner. The refrigerator was open and completely empty. A very thin young woman, with deep, dark circles under her eyes, held a baby crying from hunger. "My God," he whispered. Sarah wiped away her tears with the back of her hand. "I can't pay you back right now, but I swear that—" "No," David interrupted her, putting the bags down. "You don't need to pay me anything. Please, let me help." He took the can of formula out of the bag, prepared a bottle right there with the water Sarah had, and handed it to her. Sarah gave it to Emma, who desperately grabbed the nipple and began to suckle as if it were the last thing in the world. The crying subsided. It turned into sighs, then into silence, only the sound of her suckling. Finally being fed. Sarah broke down. She sat on the floor, leaned her head against the wall, and cried. She cried with relief, with shame, with gratitude, with everything at once. David sat beside her, respecting her space, but remaining there, just present. "How did you know?" Sarah asked between sobs. "How did you know I needed—" "Exactly that." David shook his head. "I didn't know. Really. I just felt I needed to come, that I needed to bring these things. It doesn't make sense, I know. But here I am." Sarah looked at him, really looked. And for the first time in months, she felt something she had forgotten what it felt like. "Hope, what's your name?" she asked softly. "David. And yours?" "Sarah. And this is Emma." David smiled at the baby, who was now quietly sitting in her mother's lap, finally content. "Hi, Emma. Nice to meet you." They sat there on the floor of that empty apartment, two strangers who had met at the most unlikely moment, in the most inexplicable way. Sarah didn't know it yet, but God had answered her prayer. Not with a distant sign, but with a real person, with real hands, at the exact moment she needed it most. That night was just the beginning. David didn't leave that night until he was sure Sarah and Emma were okay. He organized all the food he had brought, filled the tiny refrigerator with what he could, left diapers, wipes, even a new blanket he had in the car. Before leaving, he wrote his phone number on a piece of paper. "If you need anything at all, just call me, okay?" Sarah took the paper with trembling hands and just nodded, because if she spoke, she would cry again. In the following days, David couldn't get that scene out of his head. Sarah and Emma, alone in that apartment with nothing. It stirred something deep inside him. The next morning, he woke up early and went straight to the supermarket. He bought more things, more formula, more baby food, basic household items. He went back to Sarah's apartment and knocked on the door again. When she opened the door and saw him there again, with more bags, Sarah was speechless. "David, you don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said with a gentle smile. "But I want to. Please, let me help." And that's how it began. David came back the next day, and the next, always bringing something. Food, cleaning supplies, clothes for Emma that he bought at thrift stores. He never made a fuss, never made Sarah feel small. He just showed up, like a friend. Sarah tried to refuse several times, the shame still weighing on her chest. "I don't want you to think I'm taking advantage of you." David sat down beside her on the apartment floor. They always ended up sitting on the floor because there was no sofa. "Sarah, listen, I'm not doing this because I think you owe me something. I'm doing it because somehow I feel like this is why I'm here. You understand? My whole life I've felt kind of lost, kind of purposeless. And suddenly I find you, I find Emma, and finally I feel like I'm doing something that really matters." She looked at him, her eyes welling up with tears. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." "Then tell me," David said simply. And Sarah told her story. She talked about her difficult childhood, about the mother she lost early, about her absent father, about the boyfriend who ran away when he found out about the pregnancy, about the months working to exhaustion, trying to keep everything together, until it all fell apart. She told everything. And for the first time in a long time, someone was really listening. David didn't judge. He didn't give unsolicited advice. He just listened. And when she finished, he said something she would never forget. "You're the bravest mother I've ever known. You didn't fail, Sarah. You held it all together until you couldn't anymore. But now you're not alone anymore, are you?" Weeks went by, and David's presence became constant. He helped Sarah find a better job at a coffee shop closer to home with more flexible hours. He offered to pay a few months of back rent so she wouldn't be evicted. Sarah resisted at first. "That's too much, David, I can't accept." But he insisted, "Consider it a loan. When you can pay me back. But for now, let me help." Gradually, the apartment came to life. David brought a used but comfortable sofa that a friend was donating. He brought pots, pans, plates, kitchen utensils, even a real crib for Emma, because seeing the baby sleeping in that old chair broke his heart. Sarah started working at the coffee shop and, for the first time in months, was able to pay the bills. There wasn't much left over, but it was enough. And whenever she came home tired from her shift, David was there. Sometimes he brought her dinner. Other times he would watch Emma so Sarah could take a hot bath in peace. He never complained. He never asked for anything in return. Emma began to recognize him. When David entered the apartment, her little face lit up and she stretched her little arms out to him. And David melted. He would pick up the baby, make funny faces, talk in that silly voice that every adult uses with children, and Emma would giggle sweetly, filling the apartment with joy. One night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Sarah and David were sitting on the sofa. They finally had a sofa, drinking tea. Sarah was silent for a while, just staring at the cup in her hands, and then said softly, "Why are you doing all this, David?" "Really?" David sighed, thinking about the answer. "You know, I've spent the last 2 years of my life kind of on autopilot. Work, home, sleep, repeat. I had everything a person needs to be happy, but I wasn't. I felt empty. And then, that night, I felt something I'd never felt before. A certainty. A voice, or just a very strong feeling. Something telling me, go. And I went, and I found you. And suddenly life made sense again. Do you think it was God? Sarah asked hesitantly. David gave a small smile. I don't know. Maybe. I've never been very religious either. But somehow, I feel it was more than a coincidence. It was intentional. Sarah felt her heart clench. I prayed that night, you know. I asked for a sign. I asked for help. And then you appeared. With exactly what I needed. At the exact moment, she wiped away a tear that escaped. I think God sent you, David. He remained quiet, processing it. Then he gently took her hand. Or perhaps he sent you to me. It was there, in that simple moment, sitting on an old sofa drinking tea, that something changed between them. It wasn't dramatic. There was no background music or movie scene. It was just a longer look, a handshake that lasted longer than it should have, a warmth in their chests that neither of them expected. In the following months, David and Sarah became inseparable. He wasn't just the guy who helped out. He became a part of their lives, part of their routine, part of the family. He was there when Emma took her first wobbly steps. He was there when she said, Mama, for the first time. And then, a few weeks later, Dada, pointing at him. Sarah felt her heart melt when she heard that David had tears in his eyes. But not everything was perfect, you know, because Sarah still carried an enormous amount of guilt. A voice in her head that said, You're being a burden. You're taking advantage of him. He'll realize it and leave, just like everyone else did. One night, after a particularly difficult day at work, Sarah exploded. David had arrived with pizza for dinner, all excited, and she simply collapsed. You need to stop, she said, her voice loud and tense. You need to stop doing all this for me. David stopped, confused. What are you talking about? That's it. She pointed to the pizza, to the apartment, to everything. You doing all this? I'm not a charity, David. I'm not a project. I don't want you to stay here because you feel sorry for me. He placed the pizza on the table and took a deep breath. And do you think I'm here out of pity? Why else would you be? She shouted, tears already streaming down her face. You have a good life, David. You have a beautiful house, a great job. Why the hell would you waste your time with a broke single mother who has nothing to offer? David was silent for a moment, then took 2 steps toward her. He looked into her green eyes, so full of pain and fear, and said with a firmness she had never heard from him, Because I love you, Sarah. The world stopped. I love you. He repeated, more softly now. I love you. I love Emma. I love this life we're building together. I'm not here out of pity. I'm here because you two are the best thing that ever happened to me. And if you don't feel the same way, that's okay. I'll respect that. But don't tell me I'm here out of pity, because that's not true. Sarah froze, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst out of her chest. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever stayed. No one had ever chosen her. I'm scared, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so scared you'll leave. David approached, cupped her face in his hands with a gentleness that made her want to cry even more. I'm not going anywhere, I promise. And then he kissed her, gently, right, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When they pulled away, Sarah rested her forehead against his and whispered, I love you too. Emma, who was in the playpen, clapped her hands and shouted, Dada, Mama, as if she knew exactly what was happening. They laughed, they cried, and they held the baby together, there, in that apartment that had started out empty and was now full of life, full of love, full of hope. A year after that cold October night, so much had changed that Sarah sometimes stopped and needed to take a deep breath just to believe it was real. She and Emma had moved into David's house in Montclair, a real house, with a yard, with a room for Emma decorated with little stars on the ceiling that glowed in the dark, with a kitchen where they cooked together on weekends. Sarah still worked at the coffee shop, but now because she enjoyed it, not because she was desperate. She had stability. She had peace. She had family. David had officially adopted Emma as his daughter. On the day of the court hearing, when the judge banged the gavel and declared the adoption finalized, David cried so much that Emma, who was now almost 2 years old, became worried and began wiping the tears from his face with her little hands. "Don't cry, Dada. It's okay." And that only made him cry more. They had married in a small, intimate ceremony, with only a few close friends and colleagues present. Sarah wore a simple but beautiful dress, and Emma was the flower girl, scattering flower petals down the aisle of the little church, or rather, trying to scatter them. But in reality, she ate half the petals because she thought they were edible. Everyone laughed. It was perfect. But the most beautiful story happened one Sunday afternoon. Almost 2 years after that night, David knocked on Sarah's door for the first time. They were in the backyard, David pushing Emma on the swing while Sarah made lemonade in the kitchen. Emma laughed in that delightful way that children laugh, asking, "Louder, Dada, louder." That's when Sarah heard the doorbell ring. She went to the door, drying her hands on her apron, and when she opened it, she gasped for air. On the other side was a man she hadn't seen in almost 3 years. Shorter hair, unshaven beard, eyes she recognized because they were the same blue eyes as Emma's. It was Jake, Emma's biological father, the guy who had disappeared when he found out about the pregnancy, the guy who had never contacted them, never sent a penny, never cared if his daughter was alive or dead. Sarah felt anger rise in her throat. "What are you doing here?" Jake put his hands in his pockets, clearly uncomfortable. "Hi, Sarah. I know it's been a while. I just wanted to see her. To see Emma." "See her?" Sarah repeated, her voice rising. "You want to see her? Now, after 3 years?" "I know I was wrong. Did you make a mistake?" she almost screamed. "You abandoned your daughter. You left me alone, pregnant with nothing. You didn't answer any messages, any calls. You disappeared as if we never existed." Jake lowered his head. I know there's no excuse. But I've changed, Sarah. I'm working now, I'm in a better situation, and I thought, maybe I could be a part of her life." David appeared in the doorway at that moment, holding Emma in his arms. He looked from Sarah to Jake, immediately understanding who the man was. His jaw clenched. "Who are you?" Jake asked, looking at David and the child in his arms. "I am her father," David said with calm firmness. Jake stepped forward. "No, you're not. I'm her father." "No," Sarah said, placing herself between them. "You're the sperm donor. She pointed at David, is her father. He's the one who stays awake when she has nightmares. He's the one who changes her diapers, who bathes her, who sings her to sleep. He's the one who was there when she took her first steps, when she spoke her first words. You weren't anywhere to be, Jake. You have no right to show up here now and want to be a part of her life." Emma, sensing the tension, began to whimper. David calmed her, whispering, "It's okay, princess. It's okay." Jake looked at his daughter, a beautiful girl with curly blonde hair and bright blue eyes, who gazed at him with curiosity but without any recognition. He meant nothing to her. He was a stranger. "I want to be a part of her life," Jake insisted, but his voice was already weaker. "So where were you when I needed you?" Sarah said, tears beginning to fall. "Where were you when I didn't have money for food? When I was alone, scared, not knowing how I was going to survive? Where were you, Jake?" He didn't answer. He just looked at the floor. "It was God who sent someone to save me," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "And that someone was David, not you. You had your chance and you chose to leave. You don't have the right to come back now just because it's convenient." Jake remained silent for a long moment. Then he looked at Emma once more, at that child who was half him genetically but didn't know him, who called another man Dad, and he realized he had lost everything, that you can't recover years of absence with a visit of regret, that some choices are irreversible. "I'm so sorry," he said. And for the first time it sounded genuine. "I messed everything up, and I know there's no fixing it." He looked at Sarah. "Take good care of her. It seems like you two already are." And then he turned and left. He left. Sarah stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling. David handed Emma to her and hugged them both tightly, protectively. "It's over," he whispered. "He's gone. And we're here. Together." Sarah buried her face in his chest and cried from relief, from anger, from gratitude, from everything. Emma, not quite understanding what was happening, hugged her mother's neck and said, "Don't cry, Mama. Dada here." And David was there, as he always had been, as he always would be. In the following months, that wound began to heal. Sarah realized that Jake's visit, however painful it had been, brought closure. He wasn't coming back. He wasn't going to try to fight for custody. He wasn't going to show up again. That was the end of that story, and the beginning of another, much better one. A year later, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. This time it was different. She wasn't alone. She wasn't afraid. She was surrounded by love, by support, by a family that had been built not by blood, but by choice, by faith, by love. When the baby was born, a beautiful, healthy boy with his father's brown eyes, they named him Noah, a biblical name, because just as Noah had survived the flood, they had survived the storm. Emma, now 4 years old, was the proudest older sister in the world. She helped change diapers, sang off-key lullabies, and announced to anyone who would listen, "That's my little brother, and that's my Dada." David looked at his family, Sarah, Emma, Noah, and still found himself in moments of disbelief. How had that night, that inexplicable impulse, that decision to follow something he didn't even fully understand, led him to this point? How had he gone from an empty life to this house full of laughter, baby cries, scattered toys, noisy dinners, sleepless nights but full of purpose? One night, after the children had gone to sleep, Sarah and David were sitting on the living room sofa. That same old sofa he had brought to her apartment years ago, and that they had brought to their new house because it held great significance for them. She was leaning against it, tired but happy. "Do you remember that night?" Sarah asked softly. "The night you knocked on my door?" "I remember every second," David replied, running his hand through her hair. "I had just said a prayer, my first real prayer in years. I asked for a sign. I asked for help. And you appeared. I know. You saved my life, David." He turned her to face him and gently cupped her face in his hands. "No, love. We saved each other. And it was true. Because David was also lost that night. He was also empty. He was also searching for a purpose. And God, in his infinite wisdom, brought together two broken people, two painful stories, and made them into a beautiful story. A story of redemption, of love, of faith. Today, Sarah works for an NGO that helps single mothers in vulnerable situations. She knows exactly what it's like to be at rock bottom, hopeless, thinking that nobody cares, and she uses her own story to show that God doesn't abandon anyone, that even in the darkest moment, He is working, preparing a miracle, sending help. David continues to be an engineer, but now he dedicates part of his time to volunteering, helping families renovate their homes. He says that every nail he hammers, every wall he paints, he does thinking about that night, thinking about how a small gesture can change an entire life. Emma goes to school, makes friends with everyone, and is the happiest child you could imagine. She doesn't remember the hard days. She only knows love, security, family, and when she grows up, Sarah will tell her the story of how God answered a weak prayer with a powerful miracle, of how He is never late, of how He is always working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. Noah is still a baby, but he's already surrounded by so much love that he'll never know what it's like to feel abandoned. He'll grow up knowing that family isn't about blood. It's about choice. It's about who stays, who loves, who fights. And Sarah, when she looks back at that cold October night, at that desperate woman she was, can hardly recognize her, because God took her life, broken, empty, hopeless, and transformed it into something beautiful. into something full of purpose, into something worthwhile. She learned that God never abandons his children, that he hears every prayer, even the weak ones, even those full of doubt, and that when we reach our breaking point, that's when he begins to work. That's when the miracle happens. Because sometimes God doesn't take us out of the storm. Sometimes he puts someone in the storm with us. Someone to hold our hand. Someone to say, "You are not alone. I am here." And that is exactly what he did. This story teaches us that even when all seems lost, when there is no strength left, when faith is hanging by a thread, God never ignores a mother's cry. He does not abandon his children. He works silently, behind the scenes, preparing a future greater than any present pain. Sarah and David are living proof that miracles happen, not always in the way we expect, but always at the right time. God is never late. And sometimes, the answer to our prayer has a name, a face, and a heart. It is a person he places in our path to remind us that we are never, ever alone. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, comment what you thought, and subscribe to the channel to keep hearing stories like this. Stories that remind us that hope is always worthwhile, like the one I'm sharing with you.